My name is Dr. G. Welcome to That's Unusual, my podcast uncovering the unusual stories behind the world's most interesting people. On this show, we celebrate what makes us different and how we convert those differences into unexpected opportunities. Hello, it's me again, Dr. G, and welcome to another inspiring episode of That's Unusual. You know, we are all patients, but only one has come to be recognized as the face and voice for a growing community of activists encouraging the rise of participatory medicine. My guest today is cancer survivor and patient advocate Dave deBronkart, better known as ePatient Dave. The evolving field of health and medicine has many challenges, but having patients proactively participate in their medical decision-making shouldn't be one of them. As an industry that has historically relied on the one-sided expertise of physicians, technology and the internet have fundamentally changed the game. Patients have much greater access to information than ever before. So why then is it still so difficult to get patients to take charge of their health? As it turns out, ePatient Dave believes there is a science to patient engagement and behavior change that is not too different from how we describe the mechanism of action of a drug. On this episode, Dave shares what this means, what he has learned in his own personal journey on battling the ugly C word, what he believes is the fundamental difference between a patient and consumer, and what we need going forward so that patients play a more central and active role in their care. I found this conversation to be both inspirational and informative, as I hope you will too. ePatient Dave is an inspiring human being who believes the voice of the patient needs to be heard around the world. As you listen to this episode, I ask that you reflect on your own unusual stories and unique qualities that can help open doors to unexpected opportunities. And so with that, let's get started. Welcome to another episode of That's Unusual. I'm really excited about today's guest. I have with me Dave deBronkart, also known as ePatient Dave, the frontman on the patient engagement movement. Welcome to the show, Dave.
Thanks for having me.
So you have a very inspiring story and a very important message to get across here. And we're not going to go into the details of all of your accomplishments and all of your famous talks you've given around the world, which I encourage everyone listening to go check out. Look on YouTube, look on his website, and we'll share that information later on. But this is the year 2017. And I believe 10 years ago, you were first diagnosed with a horrible cancer that you have since overcome. I believe it was a stage 4 renal cell carcinoma. And you're now sitting here 10 years later talking to me on this podcast. I want to go back to 2007. And if you could tell us what changed pre-cancer and post-cancer. Tell us about that moment.
I need to ask a question here. But pre-cancer and post, you mean what's different about me now than 10 years ago? Was there sort of a transforming moment? I mean, a lot of people have really said, I mean, of course, having cancer really changes your mindset in terms of what brings focus into your life and what your purpose would be. Did you have some sort of transformational moment at that point? And is that when your work started around empowering the patient? I had one hell of a transformational moment. I'll tell you, supposedly Samuel Johnson supposedly said, I think it was in the 1700s, nothing focuses the mind like the knowledge that one is to be hanged in a fortnight. And in my case, I had a random shoulder x-ray right around New Year's at the end of 2006. And a few days later, my doctor called and said, your shoulder's going to be fine, but there's something in your lung. And over the next 10 days, we found out that what was in my lung, a totally lucky shoulder x-ray, incidental finding, as the doctors call it, was a tumor of kidney cancer that was one of 7 or 8, and ultimately close to a dozen, I think, in different parts of my body of kidney cancer. It's a slow-growing disease, and it had spread everywhere, and I was about to start being really sick. But at that moment, all I knew was that I was getting tired. So I had tumors in both lungs, my thigh muscle, my left femur, my skull, and ultimately one erupted out of my tongue muscle. And that was 10 years ago this week that thing popped out of my tongue. And 2 weeks later, my treatment started, and by July, my treatment had ended. I was all better. I got an early immunological treatment that usually doesn't work. Part of the mystery of life, I've learned, is, we all want certainty, but good luck with that. Well, the transformational moment was when I realized that the best available data, well, aside from the fact that you've got stage 4 kidney cancer, that's bad enough. Well, so when I went researching, what I read, the first reasonable medical website I read said things like, almost all patients are incurable. Prognosis is bleak. Outlook is grim. And the best available data said that my median survival was 24 weeks. And the idea, like suddenly, it's like seeing a fatal car crash happening in slow motion. The idea that all my dreams of the future were gone really focused the mind. Some of the personal growth work that I've done, they talk about how a game is when your mind makes up that something unreal is more important than what's really real. And when you give that up, the game is over, and then things really get real. And that's what happened to me. My feeling after I didn't die is, holy crap, I was going to be dead now, and I'm not. So it's like I got a free replay in life where I have a new playing field, a new whiteboard. I can do anything I want. And I have been liberated in my thinking, which I suspect, just to wrap up my answer to the question, I put in no more effort to change the world today than I did before I almost died, except now, through whatever mystery, I'm getting traction. So,
well, you've got certainly an inspirational story to tell. You, in fact, were given a rare gift. I mean, those statistics, for the most part, they're published that way because for most people, that is certainly true. And you're certainly one in a few who have actually come this far with such a condition. And we're blessed to have you here because you're an important voice. And I'm glad that your message, even pre-cancer, post-cancer, is now taking off. Tell us about what you ended up doing afterwards. Did anything specifically change? I mean, your mindset was still there, but what was the scene like in 2007? Because 10 years of time between 2007 and 2017, there's a huge difference. iPhones had just come out. Patients, perhaps didn't have access to the information. Paint what the scene was like in 2007, because it might be hard for some to imagine that.
Well, a really important aspect of this is I went into it assuming that when somebody gets stage 4 kidney cancer, everyone, and I'm only slightly exaggerating it, I assumed that everyone in the healthcare system would drop everything and go find the latest information and make sure it was brought to my case. Now, in my case, that is pretty much what happened because I was at a real center of excellence for this disease, Beth Israel Deaconess in Boston. That was partly because I had made a point years earlier of getting connected to an academic medical center in case I ever had a disaster. It was partly dumb luck because what I didn't know is that it is not normal everywhere you go in the U.S. or the world for everyone to drop everything and scurry to find the latest information. Now, an important thing is that in my story, and ultimately it was life-changing and world-changing for me, is that my primary physician, Dr. Danny Sands, is a pioneer of the ePatient movement starting back in the 90s. ePatients were originally like electronic, like email, but today everyone's online, so that doesn't count for anything special. Today we say ePatients are equipped, engaged, empowered, enabled. It's somebody who steps up and says, how can I help? In fact, Dr. Sands and I wrote a little book a few years ago called Let Patients Help. It's just a little tip sheet thing. It'll never win a Pulitzer Prize. But since he was one of the pioneers of the ePatient movement, I mean, he published the first peer-reviewed article about how doctors can do email without ruining their lives. And that was back in 1998. So any doctor today who gripes about email may be behind the literature, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I vividly remember this moment. He said, Dave, you're an online kind of guy. You might like to join this patient community, which at the time was on acor.org. Now it's on smartpatients.com.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I just had an interview with Ronnie a couple weeks ago.
Well, so I'll tell you. So I'm an MIT graduate, but I barely graduated. I say that because I'm scientifically trained, but I am no genius. I don't have a doctorate. I don't have a master's degree in anything. I understand science and the history of science well enough to know that it's important. When you look at a research finding, it's important to be able to ask, was this study done well? Mm-hmm. It's important to be able to poke beyond press releases. And an amazing thing happened in my case. The drug that I got, high-dose interleukin-2, sometimes kills people with its side effects. And so a disempowered patient would say, boy, I hope that doesn't happen to me, and sit back and wait. I asked the oncology team, okay, how do I prepare for this? Like, where's my side effects boot camp? Mm-hmm. And they said, that's a good question. We don't have any advice. So I turned to some people think I don't need doctors. Well, sorry. You know, doctors save my life and great nurses. I turned to them first. And when there was nothing in the literature, no advice, I turned to the patient community and said, you who've been through this drug, what advice do you have? I got 16 firsthand stories. And today my oncologist says that helped save my life. He said, I wish we could bottle what you did and administer it to other patients. So the exquisite discovery here is that I have great respect for what's in the literature, but it's not all the truth. I later learned that there are many ways that valid information can exist that either is not in the literature yet or will never rise to get over the bar to be worth funding to get into the literature. Mm-hmm. And this is where today, enabled by the internet, it's possible for activated patients and communities to find valuable information that goes beyond the literature and can save a life now and then.
So the critical piece to all of that, and you bring up some very valid points, the critical piece to that is sort of validation through the crowd, right? Because I've had a number of discussions with patients and physicians and so forth. And, clearly everyone, brings up the challenge and issues, potentially of patients misinterpreting information or not understanding what real, valid, tested, proven, efficacious data actually is. I'd even argue that a lot of physicians don't even know that and aren't trained around that. Having been through it myself, I actually learned how to examine and validate clinical studies not through my medical degree, but actually through my public health degree, which most physicians actually don't have. So you can argue on both sides that there could be potential misinterpretation and misunderstanding from the physician side as well as the patient side. But I think on the patient side, there's this additional fear of if the patient is empowered and takes control of their healthcare, and they don't understand the larger context in which their condition might be required in terms of a treatment plan, is there potential harm in that scenario for the patient, taking control of their health?
Well, so number one, thanks for saying so that I didn't have to say that there are a lot of real world problems with clinicians who have not been trained on really sharpening the knife and digging into research. There's a whole separate world of the ways that what makes it into the literature is in fact wrong or undependable. I'm sure you've heard of the decline effect in various studies about how, just Tim Horton, the editor-in-chief of The Lancet, said a couple of years ago that perhaps half of what's in the literature is scientifically weak, small effect sizes and not reproducible and so on. But regarding, is there a danger of patients doing harm by getting into information that they don't really understand? Some people say patients will scare themselves. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the doctor who was the father of the famous American jurist, actually told a graduating medical class in the late 1800s, your patient has no more right to all the knowledge in your head than he has to all the medicines in your saddlebag. He should get as much as is good for him and no more. Now, he wasn't being, it's funny, people quote that as a sign of how arrogant doctors can be. It turns out, if you go back to the source, what he was actually talking about, he was telling this graduating class of young doctors, you are going to hear things in a patient's chest, for instance, that are really bad news and there's nothing you can do about it. You do not have a right to let on and ruin what remains of the patient's life, is what he was saying. Now, today, we know an enormous amount more about how the body actually works. I was amazed as I studied the history of medicine over the last few years, because I was fascinated. How can it be that so many brilliant things happen in medicine, and yet there are so many disastrous, avoidable shortfalls as well? So I've done what I could to learn what's the life of a doctor, and how does science bring new knowledge to a case? Well, we live in uncertainty and we want certainty, right? And it's torture. And to jump to one answer to your question, Dr. Sands and I, Dr. David McDermott and I, my oncologist, we recognize together, and this takes a level of sophistication, we recognize together that things are not as certain as any of us would like. And I mean, there's a whole society now about diagnostic errors in medicine. If people think doctors are supposed to be perfect, they get really mad when there's a diagnostic error. But this is dysfunctional. One of the things I read said the body has approximately 12 ways of expressing that something's not right, like something hurts, or you've got a fever or something. And the thousands of conditions, right, to try to home in on something. So the problem is, in the past, the model was, and 100 years ago, this might well have been true, or 200 years ago, doctors know things that are possible to know, and patients don't. And so the person who can know nothing asks and gets whatever advice they get. Today, it really is possible for the patient and clinician to sit together in the uncertainty. Now, of course, I mean, if you've got pneumonia, you get antibiotics, right? There's no mystery there. But a lot of things are not that clear. And look at things and say, let's try this and see how it works.
And part of this, I mean, that's a very great perspective there. And part of this is you don't know what you don't know, right? And I think my concern from the physician standpoint is that a lot of diseases are interconnected, right? So if you look at diabetes, you look at heart disease, you look at arthritis, it's one thing to get smart and intelligent around conditions, which is typically how most people do their research, right? They don't really link one condition to another, but we know that the entire body is connected. And so, is there potential risk in going down a path or seeking, certain relief around particular conditions without understanding the full context. And this is a message and to both physicians as well as patients without looking. But any reaction to that?
Well, sure. I mean, and this is one way of interpreting what you just talked about is the famous problem of silos. And that somebody who is an expert in their world, I mean, truly an expert, and they've been encouraged by the culture of specialization to become an expert in their world. What my personal favorite podcast is Better Health While Aging by Dr. Leslie Kernison. And she has numerous pieces of advice for people who are aging or are caring for someone who's aging about things that the ordinary family physician simply hasn't been trained on, like watch out when you reach a certain age threshold about certain medications. I don't fault. Some people get mad at any doctor who's imperfect. I don't fault people for not knowing everything, including outside their specialty. I mean, when I worked in industry, just at an ordinary manufacturing company, we were taught as supervisors that you can't yell at an employee for something you haven't taught them to do. Well, and yet, if you expect doctors to be perfect, you think it's their job to know everything, even though thousands of new articles are published every day. The flip side of it, meanwhile, and there are so many things changing in the kaleidoscope at the same time that it can lead to unnecessary upset. The patient world is evolving from the patient as passive recipient of wisdom to the patient as an active partner. And it precisely parallels other social movements in education, the women's movement, and so on, where people in the past who are accustomed to being told what they should do start to have an opinion of their own. And you always find today there are many patients I know firsthand who don't want to be activated. They want to be taken care of.
And I was just about to ask that question. Yeah, well, because it's some don't want to be that involved, right, in this behavior change.
I don't object to that. I mean, people ask me during and after speeches sometimes, how do we do this patient-centered care thing? And they're looking for, so you speak in a certain way, you do this and this and this. Well, unfortunately, patients are people and people are different. There was just a wonderful thing in the New York Times this weekend that circulated on Facebook where a physician dealing with somebody who is near the end of life asked the transformational question in this article was, what are your goals for your care? And that's somebody who wants to be taken care of by all means should, that my opinion is that we should take care of them, make decisions. And somebody who wants to think for themselves, a friend of mine had a long Facebook friend, and yes, we are discussing medical stuff on Facebook, and there's some good quality discussions going on there, said his father's in the hospital, and there's trouble with managing his pain, and my friend's mother had been Googling about medications, and a resident smacked her down and said, "Stay off the internet. I'm the boss here." Well,
I think, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think part of the danger related to that is that we think we know what we want to do, but we actually, our actions, don't really match up to that, right? What we want to do and what we actually do are two separate things. So, for example, I get a Fitbit. I have this great goal. If I was asked that question of what's my goal of the care, I'd have this great goal of trying to walk my 10,000 steps a day and lose X amount of pounds over the course of the next couple of weeks. But we all know that behavior changes, and what I actually do and what I actually want to do are completely two separate things. I as a physician myself, you think I'm very proactive about my healthcare, but in some circumstances, I don't want to take control of it, which is kind of an interesting uniqueness to healthcare specifically, because we oftentimes try to compare healthcare to other industries, and I do the same as well. But the unique dynamic here is that it's hard to get somebody really proactively engaged in their healthcare, even if they have the desire to do that. And I think that's somewhat of an industry mindset change that we have to overcome and figure out ways and tools to make and promote healthy behaviors, especially as we move towards a world of preventative, value-based healthcare where people are going to be more responsible financially, even perhaps, of trying to stay healthy. Which I know I've got a couple of questions and comments loaded in there, but I really want to get to this notion of, where I was going with that is we're moving towards a value-based, preventative-based healthcare system and not so much a sick care system, which Daniel Kraft often talks about, sick care versus healthcare. And I think we need to really pay attention and focus on language and words, because all of a sudden we're not talking about patients anymore, but perhaps talking about people or consumers of healthcare. Do you have any thoughts or ideas around that notion?
Well, sure. And I want to add in, as it happens, behavioral economics and behavior change are something they've been the main focus of my personal study for the last couple of years. After all the study of the history of medicine went through eons of not having a clue what went on in the body, right? A couple hundred years ago, we thought it was 4 humors, right? Black bile, green bile, phlegm, and blood. And then we started discovering, there are germs. And then we went through this era of understanding more and more deeply about that. And we're kind of at a turning point where deeper and deeper exploration of that isn't bearing fruit the way it used to. And it turns out now, lots of people talk about environmental factors, the social determinants of health. And indeed, behavior change is going to be, I don't make a lot of confident statements, but behavior change is going to be where the next big breakthroughs are. It's a challenge for the medical system. In Let Patients Help, I said, I don't want to talk anymore about health care, because for me now, it's health and care, 2 separate things. Dr. Sands at my physical at the end of 2013 said, dude, your A1C is elevated. He didn't phrase it that way. He said, you're pre-diabetic. And I bought a Fitbit, and over the holidays, my weight went up. Just having data didn't do me any good. But then I got into the YMCA's DPP, Diabetes Prevention Program. And although my results weren't typical, over the next 4 months, I lost 30 pounds. I dropped 2 sizes in clothing. And at age 65, I became a runner. I ran a mile for the first time in my life. And I have maintained that. So behavior change is the big deal. Now, on the subject of...
In fact, I've heard, just to interrupt there for a second, I've heard there have been so many headlines where it even says patient engagement is the next blockbuster drug, which is, if anyone can really figure out the holy grail of patient engagement at an effective level, truly can make probably the biggest impact in the industry.
Well, you've just jumped to my holy grail, actually. So I want to briefly touch on patient versus consumers, because part of that personal growth training that I talked about from long ago really got into the importance of semantics. And the words that we choose create a world in the head of the person who's listening or reading. And,
very true.
And those words land in their context. To somebody who thinks the patient is with the best of intentions, they're not all jerks. I'm not saying that. To somebody who thinks the patient is someone who doesn't know what to do, you say patient, and it creates it lands with a particular little explosion of connotations. To somebody who is accustomed, I have a college friend who has beaten 3 different cancers now. When he gets a diagnosis, he does not sit back and say, well, I'm screwed. He gets to work. You say patient to him, and it's a whole different constellation of connotations. Now, some people in the activated patient world hear consumer, and they think that's belittling. That means I'm a pawn of the machine. Now, you can tell some of my friends, I'm a hippie from the 60s. Some of my friends are still radical. Well, anyway, to other people, when it comes down to a buying decision, a consumer is someone who reads consumer reports, thinks for themselves, decides what are my priorities, and goes looking. But remind me, please, what was the item just at the beginning of this where I said you've touched my sweet spot?
The holy grail about the patient engagement as the next blockbuster.
Thank you. Yes, Leonard Kish is the guy who said that. I know him well, and he and I have discussed. As it happens, he said that when I was smack in the middle of reading about the history of pharmaceuticals and the FDA, the genesis of the FDA to block snake oil, and when he said blockbuster drug, I thought, you know what? A drug has two components. Now, this is probably a simplistic approach. There is the active ingredient that actually goes in and, molecule A interacts with cellular thingamabob B and causes this mechanism of things to happen, which causes a therapeutic result. That's the active ingredient. We do not know what the active ingredient is in patient engagement. In fact, I assert that the other component of a drug is the vehicle. It's the syrup that carries the medicine, the pill, whatever, that gets the molecule into the bloodstream. And I assert that patient engagement per se is just the vehicle. And I'm actually, my website now, the tagline says, toward a new science of patient engagement. Until we understand what is the mechanism of action by which the drug, by which something turns out better when patient engagement really works. I'll give you a very simple single example of that in the interest of time. A few years ago, my mother had a hip replacement. Everything went great. When she was transferred to rehab, the records were retyped into the rehab computer, the rehab system place's computer. Somehow, her thyroid condition got typed in wrong. She's hyper, and it came in as hypo. And the thing is, so there is an error, right? And it's not just a patient safety issue, because the best doctor in the world reading wrong information will not perform to the top of his or her potential. Now, in the event, my two super activated, I call them alpha sisters, they were there and said, could we check the chart? And happily, the rehab place said, sure. In our language, they welcomed the family engagement. The error was detected and fixed at no cost to anyone. So there is a nice specimen of patient and family engagement, improving quality and outcomes. That's an active ingredient. So I want us to start getting scientific, developing hypotheses about patient engagement, patient participation that we can test so that people who run healthcare systems have evidence for building this new world.
I love that. I've never heard it in that context and that example of what is the mechanism of action behind patient engagement?
You could say that's unusual.
That certainly is unusual. And it's really cool to think about it from that standpoint. And my mind is just racing down that path. Really cool. I'm going to dig into that and really look around, what are the active ingredients that essentially make and enable patient engagement to be the next blockbuster drug. Going to this notion of blockbuster drug, I mean, you're on a speaking circuit quite a bit. I'm on the speaking circuit quite a bit. And God knows it's been 10 plus years since we've been hearing the biopharma industry talking about the need to go beyond the pill, and we need to be more patient-centered and more patient-engaged. And of course, you're on both sides of the table here, where you're not only, speaking and empowering patients in how to get more involved in their care, but you're also trying to inform the industry and saying, how do you best embrace and work with the patient to create more of a participatory care system? Are you happy with the progress we've made, let's say, in the past 10 years, or is it really frustrating for you?
Well, there's the progress we've made and there's the progress I've made. They're two separate things. I mean, I've had a lot to learn. The most transformational kick in the head book that I read is The Emperor of All Maladies, the Pulitzer-winning book about cancer. Yep. I was astounded to learn that we didn't actually even know what cancer was until the end of the 20th century. And there had been brutal treatments like radical mastectomy that everyone had just done because that's what the experts said you were supposed to do, even though there had never been a trial for them. Now, the other problem that's distinctive to the U.S. is that the business, one aspect of my background that you almost touched on is I came into this as a business person. I spent my career working in high-tech marketing, and I went through disruption. I saw my industry get destroyed by the release and redistribution of assets that became digital so that the consumer, the person with the problem, no longer needed me, my industry. And I went on to make use of that and to learn from it. But we are in a transition now, but the transition is severely held back and the transition is to patients having more ability, you could call it power, to get the care they want by shopping and rewarding innovators and so on. But we are severely impeded by two big factors which are related. One is we don't have access, we don't have the ability to easily pick up our case, our medical record, and take it to another provider, which may not sound, if you're just doing routine care, that's one thing. But man, if your mother is in crisis, it hurts. Joe Biden talked about this at the Health Data Palooza last year about how when his son Bo was dying of glioblastoma, they could not easily pull together all the best knowledge in the world. Well, I have decided now that the other aspect of this, the other problem, the Gordian knot that is the American financial medical system is so tangled, and I am not indicting any individual in this. A lot of people will throw mud. They'll call insurance executives names. What I see as a business person is that we have thousands of managers of very big organizations who are trying their best. Some may have evil intent. I'm just saying this is the structure of the problem, trying their best to prevent the equivalent of what in other industries we call a plant closure. When I lived in Minnesota 10, 12 years ago, the Ford plant in St. Paul that makes pickup trucks was being closed, and there was enormous coverage of the jobs that would be lost and so on. In the Boston area where Fort Devens, the Army base, was closed, there was lots of coverage. And so I personally have decided that in this sense, the system is analogous, and I think pretty precisely analogous, to a cancer that can't stop killing its host. And I say this with sadness because I know good people who are stuck on this train that is, I don't know.
Another great visual around it. Do we need some sort of, I know what you talk about is sort of done in the context of a movement. Do we need some sort of patient rising, or do you see that actively occurring right now?
Well, so it is starting to. I've been tracking. Kaiser Family Foundation has a graph they've been publishing every year that tracks the rise in insurance premiums and employee contributions compared to the cost of living every year, and it's an incredibly stable curve. And for years, I've been thinking, when are people going to start screaming? And it's happening now. I think a large part of the uprisings we saw in town halls in the last couple of months about people saying, don't you take away my Obamacare. I think people are starting to say this hurts now to the point where I'm going to stand up and yell about it. Meanwhile, lots of people I talk with are thinking in systemic terms, long range, long term, and that's a lot of what I give speeches about. But then my buddies, I belong to a men's chorus, and I also through social media have connected with high school classmates, college classmates, and they've started coming to me and saying, Dave, this just happened. What do I do? And I've realized that to be useful to them, I can't start talking about how many thousands of articles are published in medical journals every day. I need to give them a useful way to digest all of this into individual pieces of advice, like here's what you need to do when you can't get this document and so on. So I've decided going forward that my focus is going to be both long-term and very immediate. The immediate one is I'm in the process, and this terrifies me to say this, but I'm in the process of starting a podcast for ordinary people, distilling the things that I have been learning in all these travels and reading into just everyday advice, but really practical advice. And the other thing is I've decided that it's time to get to work at modifying the medical literature so that it contains participatory findings, the kind of research-driven things that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Because we need to, it's funny, Max Planck, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, said 100 years ago in 1918, he said, a new scientific truth does not win adoption by convincing its opponents and winning them over. It wins adoption because its opponents eventually die. And a new generation comes up that's familiar with the new view. So I want to provide evidence for medical students and recent graduates to see the new way of looking at the problem.
I love that. And it's a great, I love that. I think it's so needed. I think this, having it come from someone like you who's not only, experienced it firsthand, you understand the industry side of things, you understand how to translate the jargon and help make the consumer or the individual or customer or patient, whatever you want to call them, more health literate. I think it's an absolutely needed resource. I can't wait to hear what you come through on your podcast, and certainly let us know, and we'll certainly get the word out from there. But you've done some amazing stuff over the past several years, and it's great to know and to think that this is just the beginning. And I think, having seen you get involved with this stuff several years ago and the progress that's been made to date is completely amazing to watch. And I can't wait to see what goes forward. So, Dave, we could probably talk all day about this subject, but I want to get on to our segue into the lightning round, where I introduce a couple of fun stuff, one around word association and another one as a Mad Lib fill in the blank. So if you're good for it, unless you have anything else to share, I'd love to jump into this lightning round.
Sure.
Great. All right. So the first one we're going to do is word association, which is actually something new I introduced on the podcast just a couple weeks ago. If you're familiar with it, I'm going to give you 6 words, one at a time. And as soon as I say the word without really thinking about it, what's the first word that comes to your mind when I say it?
And weird stuff might happen.
Weird stuff might happen. Even better. All right. The show is called That's Unusual, so anything goes. All right. First word for you. Love.
Ginny, my wife.
All right. Hate.
It's affective. It's not verbal. Why?
Okay. All right. Good. That's a good answer. All right. Wonder.
Spectacular.
Passion.
Fire.
Opportunity.
Yes.
Regret.
Sad. That's it.
Good.
These are not inspiring, but there you go. You got what you got.
No, I think it's great. This is just meant to be as the first thing that comes to your mind. Maybe there's some sort of deep-rooted thing that we could probably dig into, but we'll leave it as it is. Those are great answers. All right, let's go into the Mad Lib portion. Fill in the blank. I've got some questions or comments or fill in the blanks for you here. The first one is, the best piece of advice I ever received was?
Ask yourself, how can this be?
Always asking the hows and the whys. I love that. All right, great. Next one for you. Looking back at your 20-year-old self, what would you tell your 20-year-old self?
Move to San Diego.
All right, and where did you grow up?
Well, all over the place in the Northeast, but I've never lived on the Pacific coast. And looking back, what I'd say is, dude, San Diego.
San Diego is certainly a nice town.
And I've been in Boston since college. I've been in New England since college, except for a couple of years in Minnesota.
All right. Well, San Diego it is. Good advice. All right. If you've certainly written, for a number of different venues and publications, as well as your own books. But if you had to write a book about yourself, essentially an autobiography, the title of the book would be? So thinking about this question, the book that I did write is Laugh, Sing, and Eat Like a Pig. And it was my cancer story, but it's actually pretty good for my whole life story as well. Great. Next one for you. If you could invite 3 people over for dinner, dead or alive, who would you invite and what would you want to talk about?
The 3 people are Thomas Kuhn, who wrote that book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and Doron Levy, the smartest person I ever knew, who died 2.5 years ago. And all of us who knew him still say, you bastard, we weren't done with your brain. He was the one who first told me about Kuhn, and he was also the one who taught me to ask, how can this be? As a way of inquiring into science, getting scientists' minds to open. And the other would be Dr. Tom Ferguson, the founder of the ePatient movement, who died before I came along. And we would all talk about the paradigm of health, care, and medicine, the cognitive objects that exist in our collective thinking that can either enable or restrain a transition to helping healthcare better achieve its potential. Now, I want to be clear, by the way, I didn't mention this earlier, but a major motivator for me to do this work is that I have in my studies, I've come to appreciate how hard somebody has to work to become a doctor or a nurse or a researcher. They have to do a ton of work that I didn't do in college and grad school and so on. I want them to have a good life. And to the extent that the system sucks or falls short, they are cheated out of that. Yeah,
it's very true. And Dave Chase always talks about the fourth piece of the triple aim that should be the quadruple aim. And that's putting, keeping the physicians and the health providers in mind as well.
Yep.
Very important piece. I love that mix of dinner guests there. It would be a fascinating conversation. All right, last fill in the blank for you. So, of course, on this podcast, we celebrate everything that makes us unique, everything that makes us different. And that's kind of how we define unusual. So how would you fill in the following blank? I'm unusual because I'm a random high-tech marketer who lived through being disrupted and was early in online communities, then almost died, but got saved by great medicine, yet knows enough about science to question medicine's shortfalls accurately and can give a kick-ass speech about it to any kind of audience. I love that answer. So that is essentially an N of 1 right there, and certainly what makes you unique and why I think you're an inspiration to all. So Dave, I love your answers. I love this conversation. Before we wrap up, if others wanted to find out more about you, more about the work that you're doing, get copies of your books, where would you direct them to go?
Well, it's all on my website, ePatientDave.com. As a marketer, I knew early on that once social media hit, I wanted to have a consistent brand. So if you go on LinkedIn or Twitter or anywhere or Google and search for ePatient Dave, you'll find nothing but me. And there's the books are on Amazon, and essentially everything I do, I publish as part of my activism on ePatientDave.com, or on the blog of the Society for Participatory Medicine, which is ePatients.net with a hyphen after the E. So,
okay. Well, there you have it. I cannot wait to see what you do over the next 10 years. I think what you've done historically has been truly transformational and inspirational to everybody. So with that, ePatient Dave, thank you again for joining me on the show. It was great to have you.
Just one last piece of advice for anyone who wants to think about changing the world. You've got to ask not what the hell is wrong here, but what can be said that will make any difference. That's the key to altering conversations.
What can be said that will make any difference? Love it. Well, that's a great closer. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Hi again. It's me, Dr. G. If you are still listening, I'm hoping it's because you enjoyed this podcast. If you would like to hear future episodes, you could really help me out by subscribing to the That's Unusual podcast on iTunes and leaving a review. It goes a long way in helping me get the word out from avid listeners like you. As a thank you, I will be selecting one new reviewer each week at random for a free private 15-minute phone conversation where you can ask me anything and get professional advice on your career or business to help you stand out and make a difference. Also, if you want to be notified of any future episodes, please visit that'sunusualpodcast.com and sign up to receive updates on new episode releases. Until next time, remember to always think unusual.